talk a lot about fossils today, not retention and enrollment. So a fossil essentially is any sign of ancient life. We tend to think of these things as bones, and that's because hard things fossilize a lot better than soft things. If you take a jellyfish and you cover it in dirt, you tend to squish the jellyfish beyond all recognition. We don't know a whole lot about jellyfish, but we do know quite a bit about bones. But fossils aren't just going to be bones. It's any trace of life, so that can include things that we call trace fossils. So footprints, burrows, and we call them coprolites, but poop will also fossilize on occasion. And these are all really great things that you can use to interpret behavior. There's only one problem. The poop doesn't always fossilize in the animal. The footprints don't always fossilize with the footprint in it or the foot in it. So interpreting behavior from trace fossils can be problematic because you don't always know who did it. So some examples. This is a set of camel footprints, and we know that because these are from the Pleistocene. They're from only about 2 million years ago, which isn't really that long if you're talking about fossils. We know vaguely what a camel foot looks like, and we know that they make footprints like this. Once you go back further, those footprints become harder and harder to interpret because you have all sorts of strange animals that don't have living descendants. Things like this is called a demon helix. This is a burrow structure that you can find in South Dakota. They're pretty frequent. They're beautiful long spirals with these strange additional chambers below them. And it's really hard to tell just looking at this burrow who made this burrow. It could be any number of animals that lived in South Dakota at the time. So the problem with behavior is not just that it's hard to catch the animals in the act. It's hard to catch the animals at all. Fossilization is not exactly an abundant feature. And when it is, it's usually in soils, in soil deposits called paleosols. So we think of fossils typically as some sort of fossil ash rolling down a hill and covering a bunch of animals, and they die like this, and you can tell a little bit about them. But most frequently, it's that they get eaten, and pieces of their skull end up covered in dirt. Dirt tends to be pretty slow, so it doesn't catch a whole lot of fast-moving animals. So you only get what's left behind. And when you're looking at fossils that are preserved in dirt, you don't always get evidence of behavior. Sometimes you do. So this animal right here is a beaver. It's a burrowing beaver, and it's actually the animal that was responsible for the burrow in the previous slide. So these animals were found dead in the bottom of their burrows on occasion, and so we know that they were burrowing. Moving forward to other animals can be a little bit more difficult. So we're going to talk about using all the pieces of evidence you can possibly accumulate in order to understand how these animals lived. Sometimes you do get excellent pieces of fossilization. These are 2 turtles that were caught literally in the act of mating, and they were preserved together forever. I know that they look more like they're mating like bugs, but apparently that's how turtles had sex way back in the day. Other examples are things like oviraptor. An oviraptor is a great example of how even when you do catch an animal in the act, you don't always know what you have. Oviraptor means egg thief because they thought for a long time that oviraptor was eating the eggs that it's laying on. And then they looked at some other members of that group, and they found that the eggs that they were laying on were eggs of oviraptor. So oviraptor is actually brooding its eggs like a chicken in this particular image, but they didn't know that for several decades. So the animal we're going to talk about most today is oreodonts, like the cookie. This is the skull of an oreodont. It's not real. It's a replica. I made it in haste for wedding decorations last year, so there are some holes in it. But I'm going to go ahead and pass it around. And you'll notice that the teeth, particularly the canines, are pretty sharp. So oreo doesn't actually mean cookie. It means mountain. These are mountain-toothed animals. Some people think that they're carnivores when you initially look at them because their teeth are so sharp. That's actually a lot of what deer teeth look like, except for the canines. Those are pretty scary and pretty large. But oreodonts were herbivores. They weren't carnivores. These are some selections of oreodonts. Oreodonts kind of ran the gamut as far as size goes. You had animals as small as cats, animals as large as big pigs. Some of them had trunks. I'm going to hope that this button, okay, good. So this is Brachycrus, and it developed trunks. There were also animals that were potentially arboreal. So these animals are most closely related to tylopods, so camels, llamas, that sort of thing. They don't look anything like them. They look a lot more like pigs, but we think that their closest living relative is probably a camel. So imagine a tree-climbing, trunky camel thing. And that's kind of what an oreodont is. Oreodonts live for a really long period of time. They live from the Eocene, so 50 million years ago, all the way up into the very beginning of the Pliocene, so about 9-ish. And then they went extinct. So these animals are super, super common. Part of that is, as you look at the skull, that skull is actually pretty robust. These animals had really honkin' big heads, and those heads were really hard, and it made it really easy for them to be fossilized. Paleontologists really like studying heads. We like skulls. They're not necessarily always more informative, but we think they are. So there's a lot known about oreodonts. There's a lot of species described. In many cases, we had multiple species of oreodonts from different groups living in the same area. There's actually a fossil formation about an hour and a half south of here called the Wildcat Creek Beds, and there were 3 to 5 different species of oreodonts found in it living at the same time. So these animals were really, really dominant. They lived all throughout North America. They pretty much are found in every fossil formation throughout that time period, and then they died. So that's why I'm interested in oreodonts, because they're very common, so they're easy to study, and if you like statistics, which I do, it's nice to have big sample sizes, which is helpful when they have really hard heads. So the oreodont we're going to talk about particularly today is called Primaricochirus. He's the piggy guy up at the top, and Primaricochirus is really interesting because he has really, really big cheekbones, or zygomatic arches. So these are the cheekbones of Primaricochirus. And those might not look super large to you. So here's a guanaco. With this guanaco, you've got the eye sockets right here. And then the cheekbones are these small little delicate things that are pretty close to the skull. So Primaricochirus had these really large, extravagant cheekbones that went and curved upwards. They're somewhat similar to what we see in Hylochirus, the modern forest hog. And in Hylochirus, these cheekbones are pretty large and prominent, and they're used to protect the eyes during combat. Or at least that's what we think they do. We don't really know a whole lot about Hylochirus or fossils. So the difference is Hylochirus has these big honkin' cheekbones in the front, and Primaricochirus has them in the back. So even though they may serve a similar purpose, they seem to be very different forms of evolution. So we're going to talk about these cheekbones a lot today. Yes, this is not an oreodont. This is a very cute picture of a hippo. So hippos are one of the other animals that happen to have very large cheekbones. And hippos use these cheekbones for a very specific purpose, being super terrifying. So this is a behavior called gaping. It's where a hippo opens its mouth super wide so you can see all of the really terrifying teeth. If you've never seen a hippo skull up close, I got to study some of these hippo skulls, and I could fit my pelvis into a jaw of a hippo. So they're very large, they're very scary, and they like to show off their teeth. So with hippos, they have wide cheekbones, and they have accompanyingly wide jawbones. They have mandibular angles like this, the sides of the cheekbones, that are pretty flared. And that provides the right muscular angle so that they can drop their jaw super wide and they can show off their teeth. But in Primaricochirus, the jaw is super narrow, so it doesn't seem as though the cheekbones would be useful for that purpose. One of the other reasons you could have big cheekbones is you could increase your bite force. So if you go ahead and move your jaw up and down and feel up near your temples, you can feel your jaw moving through your cheekbones, right? So if you had wider cheekbones, you could fit more muscle in there, and you could potentially have more chewing force. You have a very different shaped head than an artiodactyl does, than Primaricochirus does. So Primaricochirus, as an herbivore, was going to normally use its masseter muscle. If you increase the cheekbone width and you don't move the jawbones, you actually decrease the force of the bite. So the jaw muscle that they probably would have been using for chewing would have been less effective by having these wide jaws. So it's probably not going to increase chewing force, it's going to decrease chewing force. So this is a really big bone structure. This is not a small animal, and this is not a small feature. It's going to take a lot of biological energy to create these cheekbones. So there should be some reason potentially for them. So we're going to explore a couple of different hypotheses today. So hypothesis 1, sexual display. If you have a big fat face, the ladies like it, potentially. So that would mean that you would have sexual dimorphism. We can see this in the skulls of hippos. Hippos have wider faces for males and skinnier faces for females. So that might be the reason that you have these really big fat faces. Competition could also be one. So if these are similar to the way that Hylocheirus uses its jawbones and its cheekbones, then they could help it when it's fighting with other animals. So maybe it's male Primaricocheirus are getting very angry at other male Primaricocheirus and they're fighting. Of course, the other potential is that you would have this as a form of defense. Maybe there's some sort of vulnerable blood supply that's running through there, or some other reason that you would need to have this section of your head really well defended with a big chunk of bone. So if this is for display, there's probably going to be some form of sexual dimorphism. If it was used in competition or in defense, you're probably going to have a lot of injuries. So you guys know what Triceratops is, right? You were all 3-year-olds at one point in your life. So Triceratops has a lot of injuries on the frill and on the horns. And those are all because they were potentially wrestling with each other. And when you wrestle, you tend to scratch if you have horns. So if these were indeed used for competition or for defense, then the skull should show signs of injury in that particular region. So these are some examples of bones that have scratches and bite marks on them. And these are Tyrannosaurus rex toe bones, and those are Tyrannosaurus rex bite marks. So if you didn't know, Tyrannosaurus rex was probably cannibalistic. So these are the sorts of things we're looking for on the bones. Any sort of injury or illness or puncture mark has the potential to leave a mark. Not all of them will. If you get bit just very gently in the face, you're probably not going to have a mark on the bone. But if it's a pretty serious injury, we should see signs of it. Other signs of illness can masquerade as potential trauma or disease resulting from trauma. These are rhino toe bones. Rhinos have arthritis pretty much going back to when they evolved. It doesn't seem to matter what size they were. Poor rhinos had toe arthritis. There's even some examples of baby rhinos that have arthritis. So there are lots of diseases that can also leave marks on the bone, and we're going to be able to tell some of them apart, but a lot of them might be extinct, so it's a little hard to say. The other thing to keep in mind is we need to know whether that injury happened before or after the animal was dead, or if it happened during the process of dying. So if we confuse a scratch mark by a young paleontologist prepping a fossil for a bite mark, then we're inferring some sort of behavior that isn't necessarily true. So we're going to talk about pre-mortem, which is before death, peri-mortem, around death, like the perimeter, and post-mortem, after death. So pre-mortem, or ante-mortem. You're going to have some sort of sign of healing. In the case of fractures, you're going to have a bone callus form. A bone callus is basically like a biological Band-Aid that gets stuck onto your bone. You're going to have basically lumpiness and signs of repair around a puncture mark or around a fracture. Peri-mortem is going to be what we call green bone fractures. I'm sure at some point in your life you have tried to rip off a stick from a tree that wasn't yet dead, maybe a Christmas tree or something. And if you split it, it kind of splinters everywhere. It's really difficult. It's really elastic and it bends. Well, our bones actually do that to a certain extent too. When you're alive, your bones have collagen in them and they are slightly flexible. So you'll see things like radiating fractures around puncture holes. You'll see jagged edges and strange shapes forming, accompanying different breaks. And it basically looks like the bone was slightly bent. And you won't see any sign of healing. So that's going to be peri-mortem. If it's post-mortem, so the animal has been dead for maybe a couple of days, it's had a little chance to dry out, and it's getting scavenged by something, you're not going to see any sign of healing. The bones are going to lose that collagen, so they're not going to be elastic and kind of rubbery anymore. And you're going to have dry snaps, essentially. So you're going to have pretty straight fracture lines. Preparation damage tends to fall into this category. Because fossils also become rocks, preparation damage also looks like the sort of damage you would do to a rock. You can see crystalline structure that's been modified afterwards. And that I couldn't find a very good picture of, but I feel like this is a pretty good approximation of some sort of post-mortem injury. I could watch that for days. All right, quiz time. Do you guys think this is pre-mortem, so before death, around the time of death, or after death? This is probably peri-mortem. You guys can see that there are some radiating fractures out from around the edge. It obviously didn't have time to heal. This is some very sad human that had a puncture mark. I stole it from the internet. I don't know what happened to him. What about this one? Raise your hand if you think pre-mortem. How about peri? How about post? Was that you that said post? No. He's my husband. I can call him out if I want to. So this is probably pre-mortem. You can see that there are signs of bone remodeling. It's not just a straight shot through. There's no obvious fractures left over. Basically, the bone is kind of lumpy and bumpy, right? All right, what about this? This is an oreodont. It's not a person. Can you guys find the fracture or the puncture to begin with? So it's right here. This is Protoriodon. This is an Eocene one. This is from Texas. All right, raise your hand if you think pre-mortem, peri-mortem, post-mortem. This is probably peri-mortem. So you can tell because you've got these radiating fractures. Pre-mortem, you would have signs of remodeling. So the bone wouldn't look clean cut. It would look bumpy, essentially. So probably peri-mortem. Whoop. It's possible that it would be post-mortem. What about this stuff down here? That's probably post-mortem. What about this thing? Worm?
Scent glands.
Scent glands. That's a foramina, yeah. So that is actually a natural hole in the head. That's where blood vessels and nerves come out and also go back in. So oreodonts actually have a lot of them. They're highly variable like they are in camel skulls. So it can be kind of tricky sometimes to tell the difference between one of these very abundant holes for nerves and some sort of healed bite mark. But some clues are you're going to have two here. Sometimes they double because the bone will actually form around the nerves. So if your nerves are a little weird when you're a baby, your bone's going to be weird too. And then they actually have quite a few back here as well, which is not very typical for skulls, but it is in camel skulls. So this huge one is the puncture that we're looking at. If you get confused with a foramina, don't worry, my co-author did too. Okay, what about this one? This is Primary So this is the animal we're going to talk about today. Can you guys even see what we're looking at? There's a couple different things here. What about this huge cut here? That's going to be post-mortem. This is actually glued back together. This gigantic specimen was found in the rock, and they took a rock saw to him, and they didn't know how big he was. So part of him got rock sawed off and then glued back together. What about this? That's post-mortem. That's another straight line fracture. That's going to be probably a fossilization process as well. What about this thing?
That's like bone injury.
That's a bone injury. Yeah, so this is pre-mortem. This is a bone callus. This is the nicest example I've ever found of a bone callus. It's basically this big, nasty bone Band-Aid that's on top of a fracture. So I didn't have access to an X-ray machine or an MRI or a CT scanner. So everything that I was looking at had to be visible on the surface. If you've actually healed a bone injury to the extent that the bone callus has been reabsorbed, I would not have been able to tell that you had a fracture. So keep that in mind when we talk about the number of injuries we're seeing. Chances are there were a lot more injuries that just weren't visible from the surface. So bone injury is not great. You can get it from being predated upon. You can get it from fighting with your conspecifics. I don't know if you guys have seen this picture, but that is a dead elk stuck to another elk. Yeah, so these sorts of infraspecific combat and combat with other types of animals can be pretty devastating. But it's not just the bone injury that you have to worry about. It's the resulting infection. So if you get bit badly enough that there's a bunch of blood involved, there's openings, you can get infections. Some of them are called osteomyelitis. So osteomyelitis is a form of bone infection, essentially. It's a pretty generic term, where bacteria are close enough to the bone, or they're actually forced directly into the bone by the pressure of a bite mark or some other form of traumatic injury, and they infect the bone itself. They form these big, nasty necrotic centers that actually can become so bad that your bone basically becomes filled with pus. The pus has too much pressure, and it forms, I hope you guys didn't eat before this lecture, it forms nasty drainage tracts that will actually look like punctures. So punctures from like a tooth or a claw can actually be drainage tracts from bone infection, and it can be really difficult without an X-ray machine to tell the difference. So throughout this talk, I'm going to classify them all as puncture marks. Chances are some of them are nasty pus tracts instead. So this is an example of a human femur that has osteomyelitis. It has a pretty nasty set of bone infection. You can see the drainage tract here and here and here. They look a lot like puncture marks. They're accompanied with this really strange, rugose, bumpy texture. So that is what we call a periosteal reaction, which is a super generic term. Basically, the periosteum is the outside of the bone. It's like a thin skin that lives on the outside of your bone. And if you bump your bone, or your bone gets infected, or someone looks at it funny, the periosteum has a reaction. It lifts up and redeposits new bone underneath it. That bone can take a lot of different shapes. Sometimes it forms onion-like skins. Sometimes it forms bumps. Sometimes it forms striations. You can get these weird sunburst patterns. And those can be from disease. They can be from trauma. Things like syphilis will leave periosteal reactions, bone bruises, which is where you hit your bone but not hard enough to break it. Tumors, all sorts of different things. And those can be tissue-specific reactions. So I'm not going to try and diagnose these periosteal reactions, in part because it's a little hard to diagnose an animal that's been dead for 30 million years. There may have been a lot more diseases out there that are not here at this point in time. But also because the patterns aren't necessarily diagnostic. So while it would be really nice to be able to look at this particular texture and say, it's filigree, it must be osteomyelitis, that's not always the case. So anytime that there was a periosteal reaction, we're going to classify that as some sort of infection or trauma, and we're just going to call it periosteal reaction. So I looked at 54 individuals from 6 different formations. Those are from South Dakota, Nebraska, Oregon, and Montana. I didn't get a chance to look at the Washington specimens yet. I'm really sorry. Apparently they're in Montana. So there were a lot of examples of punctures, both healed and unhealed. This guy right here, this is from Chicago, and there's a nice little bite mark here and kind of an adjacent bone spur. There's also quite a bit of periosteal reaction. That bone should be smooth, and it's not. That's a juvenile specimen, by the way. This is a great example of all of the different types of periosteal reaction you can see. Well, none of those lights work, so we won't worry about it too much. It's getting worse. Oh, I just had to be patient? Oh, thanks, Dave. Okay, not my strong suit. So we've got 2 big punctures, one right here, a couple of little adjacent punctures, a bunch of strange bumpy texture. Some of it's kind of sinusoidal, which is usually osteomyelitis. Some of it is very linear. We're not really sure what that comes from. So this is a great example of all the strange things that bone can do when it's bumped or diseased or just strange. There were quite a few examples of, well, not quite a few. There were some examples of bone calluses and bone spurs. Bone spurs can form from a couple of different things, but a bone spur can also form after a fracture. So once you try and knit your bone back together, sometimes your bone goes a little wonky and you can develop spurs. So we're using it to try and indicate fractures. And then cheekbone malunion. So this led me down one of the weirdest pathways of my entire dissertation. I read a lot of really strange literature and had a really large number of very upsetting Google image searches. But the weirdest paper by far was I had to read a plastic surgery paper. Apparently in parts of Asia, moving and changing of the malar bone, part of the zygomatic arch in the eye socket, is really common. And if you don't do it correctly, then when you chew, your bones get pulled apart. And that seems to have happened in some oreodonts as well. So your cheekbone is made up of 2 different sections that sit on top of each other. And in humans, those seem to be pretty well stitched together. And in oreodonts, they're not stitched together at all. They really are just 2 bones gently resting on top of one another. So if those bones get jarred, either through fossilization that has lateral compression or through some sort of weird jaw injury, they move apart, which I can't imagine is a very pleasant way to chew or live. So we're going to see some examples of that. So puncture marks. These were definitely the most common. They took quite a few different forms. There was only one really nice smooth one. That's this one here. These are the foramina. Don't worry about those. It's this little guy here. We had this really nice big one. Some of them were partially healed. So this is a tiny puncture mark, and it's got 2 pieces of additional bone spur kind of growing on top of it. It's actually got one on the other side as well. That's not supposed to be there. A lot of these were very small. Some of them were pretty big. Some of them may actually have been bone lesions as opposed to puncture. So even though I'm showing you punctures, remember that not all the time you're going to get hit by that tooth mark or that claw directly down. You might get scratched as well. So some of the things that we're looking at may actually have been scratches that are attempting to heal themselves. There were some pretty gross ones over in the Carnegie Museum. This is a puncture mark right here, and the whole bone is swollen and very strange looking. The individual also had another sort of strange swelling on the cheekbone on the other side, but it didn't match. I really like this picture. This is the underside of a cheekbone. This entire section was swollen to be about that thick, and then the other side, the cheekbone was about that thick. So it was a pretty grotesque looking animal. And then on occasion, these animals just had missing bone. So if your bone gets bit or knocked or broken, and then that floating remnant never re-sutures itself, that's not going to fossilize super well. It's going to fossilize separately and potentially not at all. It might be reabsorbed. So there are quite a few specimens that have these basically like half-moon shapes chunked out of them. So this is an example of periosteal reaction. This animal has a bunch on the orbit as well, and then the whole zygomatic arch is very rugose and strangely textured, and it has another big chunk taken out of it. And again, if you want to understand whether or not that's normal, you always look at the other side. On the other side, it looked very, very different. So this is one of those examples of zygomatic malunion. So in this particular example, this is the zygomatic arch. You're looking at the underside. This is the teeth. That's the palate, so the roof of the mouth. So this is what the zygomatic arch is doing. And you can see that the palate itself is pretty crumpled. Palate should be relatively flat, and this animal has a concave palate, which means that this animal was probably compressed after death. So most of the examples of zygomatic malunion, I think, probably happened post-mortem. These animals were probably squished in the right direction after they died. Not all of them. This is an example of cheekbone malunion, where the animals, even though it's crumpled because it's become a rock, the palate itself is relatively intact. It's still pretty flat. There's no evidence that the animal was laterally squished. And yet the cheekbones are completely ajar. On this side, the cheekbone is missing, so it's hard to say whether it was on both sides. In all of the cases of zygomatic malunion, the front part of the cheekbone was the part that moved in. So it seems to be the floater, I guess. So if this animal was alive, while the zygomatic arches were disconnected, there's no sign of healing. There's no spicules trying to pull it back together. So either this happened after the animal died, or the animal was not capable of fixing it. Maybe it didn't matter, but I kind of feel like that probably would matter. That sounds very painful. So bony calluses and bony spurs, most of them happened on the cheekbones. There was one example where it happened on the outside of the eye socket as well. So overall, we had, out of 54 specimens, 6 that had calluses or spurs on the zygomatic arch, 1 that had it on the orbit. Remember, we're looking to see whether there's a pattern of, are they hitting the zygomatic arch, or are they getting bit kind of all over the face? Misaligned zygomatic arches, there were 4 specimens. I think 3 of them were probably post-mortem. 1 of them, it's not easy to say. 18 specimens had puncture marks on the cheekbones themselves, all of which showed signs of healing. So none of them seemed to be peri-mortem or post-mortem. And 5 had punctures that were elsewhere on the skull. Of those, 3 seemed to show signs of healing and 2 didn't, so they appear to be peri-mortem. Periosteal reaction was definitely very common, which is partly because it's a very generic term. 23 of them had periosteal reaction, so some sort of bone bruising or potential illness on the cheekbones. 6 had it on the eye sockets, and 2 had it on the sagittal crest. That's this part right here. So by and large, most of these injuries are happening on the zygomatic arch. So 31 specimens had some form of injury to the zygomatic arch, the cheekbone. So that's consistent with these being used for either competition or defense, which means that we should test the next possible hypothesis would be, are these sexually dimorphic? Do you have boy oreodonts and girl oreodonts? It's not always an easy question to test. We don't have skirts that we can look up for these guys. So zygomatic arch width, skull length, the front to back length of the canine, and the canine height were the measures that I looked at. And these all look, if you're familiar with what a normal distribution should look like, this looks pretty normal. These are pretty normal distributions. I did do a Hartigan's dip test. It wasn't significant. So evaluated independently, there doesn't seem to be any evidence for sexual dimorphism. But if you put them into a finite mixture analysis, which basically compares these distributions together and asks whether or not they're better fit by more than one distribution, they are significant. So this is just zygomatic arch and skull length. Unfortunately, I don't have the right sample size to do all 4 characters together. It seems that you either preserved your cheekbones really well or you preserved your canines, not both. So there were 4 overlapping distributions. It did significantly better fit the model here. That's 4 though, not 2, right? So if you have a boy and a girl, usually you're going to have 2. So it happened in canines as well, even though it looks super strange. There was a better fit by 4 overlapping distributions as opposed to 2. Why 4? What do you guys think? Yeah, there's 2 species. So I was doing a genus level analysis. And these are coming from 2 different regions. You've got your South Dakota and Nebraska specimens, and you've got your Washington and Montana and Oregon specimens. So they actually have 2 fairly different morphologies as well. So I kind of knew going into it that there were probably 2 species. They are conveniently identified as about 19 species, because that's how fossils work. But it's great. South Dakota and Nebraska specimens have these kind of banana-shaped zygomatic arches where they're really skinny, really skinny at the front, get really fat down below, and get skinny up again at the top. Whereas the Oregon and Washington specimens are kind of about the same width all the way along. And if you toss those measurements into an ANOVA and you separate them out by the 2 regions, they are significantly different. So there is also a relationship between the size of your face and how likely you were to have bite marks. If you toss that into a logistic regression, when you have a wide face, you're more likely to have been bit in said face. So if you're looking at this chart, the filled in dots are going to be your pathological specimens, so they have some sort of peristeal reaction or puncture. And then they're color-coded by the different regions. You can see they're kind of mixed in together. But essentially, the wider the face, the more likely you are. That doesn't necessarily mean that if you had a small face, you didn't get bit in your face. You did. And there were some juvenile specimens that couldn't have been, according to how long it takes camels to get their teeth in. These probably were about 3 or 4-year-old specimens, and they also had bite marks and peristeal reaction. So your age actually didn't seem to determine it. Didn't matter how young you were or how long your face was, but if you had a wide face, you were more likely to get bit in it. And these things are cross-correlated. So if you had bite marks, you probably had peristeal reaction, which makes sense because peristeal reaction means that you got hit or you were sick, potentially because you got hit first. So discussion and conclusion. Basically, at this point, the injuries seem to be concentrated on the cheekbone, regardless of what type of injury they were, especially healed ones. Punctures seem to be a lot more common than fractures, which again, remember that because I can only tell if it has a fracture if it's still in the process of healing, so in that 2-month time span after the fracture, it's quite possible that there were more fractures. I was expecting more fractures because these animals have really large cheekbones. I figured they were probably using them to slam one another with. But from this data, it seems like there's more bite marks and potential drainage tracts than there are actual break marks. Almost all of them show signs of healing, so even though these animals seem to have led very traumatic and aggressive lives, they do seem to have survived them. Periosteal reaction is probably some form of bone trauma or bone infection, since it's correlated with all of these punctures. But it would also make sense if they're all drainage tracts. So if none of the tooth marks actually penetrated bones, and all of the puncture marks that I'm looking at are those seepage tracts from pus, it would also make sense that you're going to have some periosteal reaction that's cross-correlated with that. Bigger cheekbones, more likely to get bit. And that's interesting because Primaerococcurus seems to be found in groups. So at the beginning, I mentioned how it's really hard to capture this sort of behavior. Well, sometimes your animals die cuddling together in a sandstorm, which is what these three individuals were doing. So here's skull 1, skull 2, skull 3. Here's a little diorama. This is from the Carnegie Museum. It's the cutest death assemblage I've ever seen. And that's really interesting to me, and that's part of why I wanted to do this project, because this is very, very old to have evolved herd structure. So here's kind of the general way of thinking about how herds evolved. And if you don't know a whole lot about evolution or about fossils, it seems pretty obvious that herding is a really advantageous thing, right? That if you live in a herd, maybe they're going to eat your neighbor instead of you. Well, we're not entirely positive at what point herds evolved, because herding seems to be very strongly associated with open habitat. It's really hard to form a herd of 60 people or 60 antelope if you're in the woods. So almost all herds are found in open habitats, and habitats haven't always been open. So the current thinking is that animals form pack hunting behavior. So your dog started to hunt in groups. That made herds evolve. They wanted to form structures so that they wouldn't get eaten. And that formed grasslands. So pack hunting behavior, we have evidence for that going back 16 million years when you look at brain structure from endocasts, and when you look at just overall morphology. That seems to be about the earliest that we know of with herd or pack hunting behavior. Grasslands form about 3 million years before that. So right off the bat, if these dates are accurate, that doesn't seem to be a very good picture. You have grasslands before you have pack hunting. But the animals that I've just been showing you, which have injuries that are consistent with a pretty aggressive and formalized social structure, which is usually what you would find in a herd, are all the way back in the 25 to 30 million year range. So if these animals were actually herding, they started herding before pack hunting began, and indeed before grasslands evolved. If you guys ever watch a dinosaur movie and you see lots of grass in it, you should know that's an obvious flaw. There was no grass when there were dinosaurs. Grasslands only actually evolved 19 million years ago, and grasses themselves only evolved in the late Eocene. So these animals could potentially be some of the earliest herding animals that we know of for mammals. So this project is not finished. There's a lot of different things that I could potentially be doing, but these are the things I'd most like to do. I'd really like to do finite element analysis. So I've shown that there are lots of holes. It's not conclusive that they're bite marks. It's also not conclusive that other oreodonts did them. So it's possible that these bite marks were caused by other animals, or that they weren't bite marks entirely. If you take an animal, or take a skull and you CT scan it, you can do this thing called finite element analysis. People do it for engineering projects as well. And you can look at the potential stresses that that skull would have been capable of resisting. So how hard could Primaerococcurus bite? Could it bite through bone? Could it bite to bone? Or was it just kind of a nibbler? I don't know, which is why I have to do this analysis. And I haven't looked at a relationship between cheekbone thickness and injury. So cheekbones tend to kind of come off in the fossilization process. 54 skulls is a pretty good sample size, but if I could just look at cheekbones, I'd have a huge sample size. So part of the problem is that when I did this, I used photogrammetry. Has anybody heard of photogrammetry? Some of you. So it's basically you take a bunch of pictures of a specimen and you can make a 3D model of it. It's really, really great if you're trying to finish your Ph.D. in 4 years and you really want to go to a bunch of museums, and then you could do your measurements and analysis after you actually figure out what you're doing, which is what I did. But it's not so great if you want to measure thickness, because you get the top of a skull and the bottom of a skull. And then you have to spend hours and hours of post-processing stitching them together, and I didn't want to do that. So I would actually have to do that in order to figure out whether or not thickness was a good correlate for injury or for sexual dimorphism, which it probably is. X-rays would be really great. I have a colleague who's maybe going to be able to X-ray some of the Carnegie specimens. We are actually CT scanning one of the specimens down at University of Oregon in the next couple of weeks, so this one might actually be possible in the next couple of weeks. And then redescribing species. That's a pretty common thing in most biology fields, I think, but definitely in paleontology. Going from 19 species to about 2 is going to be a really boring paper that I will have to write. And that's all I have for you guys. Thank you for listening to me, and thanks for inviting me.